I am on one side of a chasm. She is on another, this woman who is sitting on the floor of my office. Between us lies a roiling pit of fear. She wants to know whether hope is worth the effort, whether anybody or anything is worth trusting. And I am listening, I'm holding my breath, that her words can begin to build a little span of a bridge between us. I am speaking and sending out trusses and beams towards her wavering hands, because if we can build this bridge of trust, then the fear will not engulf either of us. Trust is a bridge between one thing and another. It's the connective tissue that makes all relationship possible. In who or in what do we trust? So often we encounter those times when we need to know how to fill in that blank. In what do we trust? It's so easy for us who like to question, who like to analyze. It's so easy for us to know what we don't trust, who we don't trust, and what we erased to create that empty line. And yet, without trust, things just don't work. Too often in this world, we are hearing people talk about what we can't trust, who we couldn't trust, who we shouldn't trust. But we can't be in any kind of society without trust. Think about somebody who trusted you and allowed you to do something you could never have done without that trust. Next weekend, I'm going to go home and be with my church family where I started, back in North Carolina, because that was the place that for the first time I felt that deep, abiding trust. And I knew I could do anything I wanted, and it changed my life. Think about who trusted you and who brought you up to a new level of being through that trust. Because trust isn't just for intimate or family relationships. Think about how many acts of trust you have to go through in just your average day. You have to trust that the pharmacist gave you the right pills, although it's always good to check. You have to trust your partner to back you up when you forget something. You have to trust your children to be where they're supposed to be at least most of the time. You have to trust your colleagues to carry their weight at work so everything can get done. You have to just trust the world that it will give you the day you need. Trust undergirds every aspect of our being, and it's trust that makes it possible for us to live, to love, and to thrive. Now, there's a man named Paul Zak, and he invented his own field. He calls it neuroeconomics, and he studies how relationship and trust affects us in the marketplace. Because when you think about it, businesses rely a great deal on trust. You leave your watch or your car to be repaired because you're pretty certain you can trust that you will get it back after they do what they need to do to it. Most of the time that works out okay. Trust is really the basic currency of our economic system, and it's what allows it to work. And when we talk about currency, the phrase, "in God we trust," was only put on our money during the Civil War. It was supposed to be sort of a morale booster. It was put on our paper money in the 1950s, and it's remained there despite several attempts to get it removed as a very obvious, unsavory mixing of religion and government. But it does, in fact, illustrate that as consumers and citizens, what's ironic is sometimes we trust the marketplace today much more than we trust our government, or maybe God. Despite being less than a decade away from the great financial abuses of the mid-2000s, in many areas it seems like our trust in our economy and our economic players is increasing as we put more and more of our lives in the marketplace. And trust in government to do what's right has fallen from a high of 77% in 1964 to today's 19%. 19% of us trust that government will do the right thing most of the time. That bridge of trust is bearing very little weight these days. A man is staring at a phone where an improbable and unexpected voice has just informed him that he has lost his job. The work of his lifetime has just disappeared in a simple phone call. We have times when we need to know what we can trust, because trust is like a bridge, and it can sustain at times structural damage when something happens that just rocks our world. And when it does, it's expensive to repair, and the restoration can take a long time. It's not quite as quick as with our Time for All Ages most times. Sometimes when trust is broken, the ultimate decision about whether or not it can be repaired is not yours. You may see that your intentions are good or understand your own motivation for something that broke trust, but you're out here yelling on your cliffside across that chasm of fear where the other has turned away and is no longer listening. Perhaps you realize that that bridge of trust between you and someone you love and respect was never the strong archway you imagined it to be. And while you may be willing to rebuild that bridge, to lay that foundation again so painstakingly and slowly, you cannot make that decision with another person all by yourself. Our Unitarian Universalist heritage tells us that we all have the possibility of being both trustworthy and also trusting. And when it's beyond our control, that is where our largest trusts come in, because this is always, our relationship with the ultimate is always a trust that we can rebuild. Two boys are riding their bikes down the busy street near where I live. Busy street. It's rush hour. And they're riding, the front one in the front is riding like this. He's got his head down between his arms and his eyes are shut. The one behind is throwing out directions. Go a little to the left, go a little to the right. And I'm thinking, this is not a good way to illustrate trust. This would be what many of us would think is a misguided trust. And we, who are the ones of questions, the ones of analysis, are wary of ill-placed trust. Yet in our wariness, how do we avoid eliminating the very bridge of trust itself? Do we build a bridge from ourselves to that which can guide our choices and our days, or do we spend our time watching our mental video replays about the day that we blew up the old bridge? Which does have its satisfaction in the moment, but it has a diminishing return. So again, I want you to look at the front of that order of service if you're willing. It says, "In blank we trust." Now, often in our tradition, we focus on the erasure, that blank that we've created by getting rid of whatever it was we got rid of. A patriarchal and dominating, narrow and nonsensical idea of God, perhaps. Our spiritual roots are among all of the traditions, which wondered and questioned from the very first people who looked up at the stars and wondered about their relationship with them, to us today, thinking about our relationship to a shrinking and endangered planet. We celebrate our right to choose for ourselves, and I want to be clear that I think it is just as important for us to choose what we do believe in than to choose what we don't. It is important for us to fill in the blank. We need to spend as much time thinking about what we do trust and allow it to be a guide. Because otherwise, what we actually allow to be our guide is what we don't trust and our reaction to it. I look out my window, I see a stray dog bouncing around on the cul-de-sac on which I live. This dog is quite anxious, quite frantic, because in his anxiety, he keeps going back to the same closed fences, just determined, instead of going out the street the way he came in, to go out a way that there is no way to go out. Now, having raised many undertrained dogs in my life. I know how to get a dog who will not come to me, so I start with the technique. You throw a little bit of food out fairly far from you, and then you throw a little bit of food a little bit closer, and a little bit closer, and a little bit closer, until the dog and I are sitting on my front porch. He's eating out of my hand, and I'm calling his owner to have him returned home. Trust is a bridge. It can last a lifetime. Writer David Rico says that we have to be able to be an adult in spirituality. We have to be able to talk and focus more on what we do believe and what that means for us and how we use it to make choices in our lives than what we don't believe and how that defines us. When I think about that, about adult spirituality, I think about how bad it would be if I had to constantly be limited to my past, for example, in the area of music. If every time someone asked me, well, what kind of music really speaks to you, really rocks you, what really embraces your soul, I were to say, I no longer listen to punk rock. And that was the sum of my answer. It would be very incomplete and very unsatisfactory. It would be much different to say, I love all kinds of music. I love classical, I love contemporary. I love when people write their heart in a song. That's a different thing than saying what I no longer love. It's important. Now, some of us believe out there that what's worthy of our highest trust is innate to who we are. It's just a sense of a higher self within our own self. And others of us out there believe that there is actually something outside of ourself that attracts or compels us to move towards that which is more whole and true and just, as the choir sang. Some of us believe that all forms of ultimacy are found within the human experience, and others of us believe there are forms of experience outside the human frame. And for some of us, it's a little mixture of both. But again, it's about how we fill in the blank, not about creating the blank. If I focus on the things that I want to get rid of rather than the things I want to take into my life, then I'm constantly trying to bridge across that chasm of fear, and I miss the larger connections. The thing is, this really actually isn't an intellectual exercise about what ideas of ultimacy actually have the most merit. It's actually a decision about what choices we're going to make in our lives every day because of what we believe. If I believe that the highest aim in my life is community, then how am I prioritizing giving time and effort and energy to my communities? And if I believe that there's some force out there that's larger than me that requires me to be an active partner in the co-creation of the world, then how am I making the time and the space to be part of that co-creation? I am listening to a story of a man, and he is telling me the story of his life. And he's telling me and praising God every other word. And as he tells the story, it becomes clear to me that that idea of God, that idea of a stern, rule-bound God, is what allowed him to move his life out of the frame in which he was born. It was a frame in which there were always drugs, there was always violence. And he has created a life through his belief in a God that loves him, which is a frame in which there is love, in which there is joy, in which there is caring. That might not be my frame, his God, but I can understand as I listen to him why that God is so essential to be in his space. So important to saving his life. Because whether we have a basic trust or distrust of the world determines our fate. Perhaps the final act of trust among us here has to always be to understand that even though we might have different beliefs among us, we are still bound in unity together. Our different views of the ultimate don't create that chasm. They can in fact be the bridge. We can continue to look at what we believe together and to gather around a welcoming table and discuss and talk about and argue and understand each other's contexts. To have, as one study in our association suggested about 10 years ago, a chance to engage our theological diversity and not just eject it and ignore it. Because we need one another and we need to be bound together in trust. As a religious community, we know that all relationships of trust will withstand more quakes than relationships that are built on shoddier foundations, say of conformity or of a surface peace, because repairing that kind of relationship is almost always futile. We need to be informed and guided by the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who cautioned us against a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, and asked us to look instead to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. We can trust our diversity of beliefs because you know what? They are always with us. In what do you trust? How do you fill in the blank? Maybe not with something tangible or definitive. Maybe with something more metaphorical. Biblical scholar Marcus Borg reminds us, metaphors can be profoundly true. Even though they're not literally true, metaphor is poetry plus, not factuality minus. That is, metaphor is not less than fact, but more. Some things are best expressed in metaphorical language. Others can only be expressed in metaphorical language. And that is the way in which our second video clip showed we walk by a truth we can sense and not know, like that oneness, the unity that they were discussing, which we draw from our Jewish roots. You know, every day we see what it means to live in a world in which there's very little trust in anything except human ego and the consumptive excesses that it is required to feed those insatiable appetites. In who or what do you trust? Can you trust, or are there fears that need to be bridged? Ask yourself, how can your trust be large enough to allow someone else to trust something different from what you trust? And how can we, in this next phase of our living and growing together, invite one another to that welcome table, which is glad and also a place we get to only after struggle? In this world today, I, for one, would feel better if we spent a lot more time talking about what we do believe rather than what we don't. Whether it's a deep and abiding faith in the human spirit and agency, or whether it's a more metaphorical sense of spirit or God. We need to talk about it because it is the bridge which allows us to connect to the power to make the choices about how we invest our time, talent, and treasure in our world and in our lives every day. And we need to allow it to be our guide. For if we do that and we follow that guide, what a joyous journey. What a wonderful communal meal. Walk across that bridge. Fill in the blank. Celebrate our shared journey in trust and love and unity.